and by the time people will join. So yeah, so welcome everyone. Welcome to Product Tank Heidelberg November meetup. So we are meeting up uh, probably for the last time for this year, but we saved the best one for the last, and you have a very good fun evening this today. So today I'm your host Swanan Marulkar. I'm joining Michelle and Anya is joining me to host this event. And I'll go over a little bit about uh, what Product Tank is. If you're joining for the first time, it's the world's largest product community. It started in 2010 and is now active in more than 200 cities around the world. It is built by product built by product people for product people, and Product and Heidelberg is now almost 1.5 year old. We officially launched in May last year. Uh, and If you are interested in all other product tanks, we would recommend you can always go to Mind the Product, and you can follow the channels, and you will learn more about the conferences as well as other product tanks that are organized in various cities. I'll talk a little bit about, community. So this is a quite big community of product people. We love to have you here, and you are involved you can get involved in multiple ways. So you're attending the product tank today, but you can also speak at any product tank. You can host if you are joining from a city where the product tank doesn't exist. You can host the product tank. You can start a new product tank. You can also write in mindtheproduct.com or become the Mind the Product members. So you can find more information about it at mindtheproduct.com, and the link is in the on the slide. So today is quite an exciting day. We, as you see on the screen, we have a book giveaway. So please hold on till the last. We'll all people who are joining, will put them in the draw and will announce the winner in next couple of days for these books. So these are more than one book, as you can see, to give away. Uh, so this was possible because of our sponsors. So I'll quickly talk about our sponsors. So Springer Nature. Springer Nature is one of the biggest scientific publishing company, and Springer Nature advances discovery by publishing robust and um, insightful uh, content, develop new areas, and making ideas and information accessible around the world. And it is one of the leader in open access publishing. Uh, and we are very glad that we are being sponsored today by Springer Nature. So for the vision, the main vision of Springer Nature is opening doors to discovery, and this helps in researchers finding their way during their research. You can see a lot of trusted brands are under Springer Nature umbrella. It is working in four major sections: research, education, health, and professional. And you can see there are a lot of product work goes around in this company. There are a lot of well-known journals and books that are being published by Springer Nature. And uh, Springer Nature is having almost 9,000 people worldwide, with more than 200 offices and locations across 45 countries. And you can use the QR code you see on the slide to learn more, or go to the link that you see on the slide to learn more about Springer Nature. And with that, I Now, I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, David Blind. Welcome, David, to ProductTank Heidelberg. David is CEO and founder of Recoil. David helps people test business ideas. I guess you can uh, sense this by the book that he has co-authored with Alex Osterwalder, which the title is Testing Business Ideas, and we'll go deeper today in that topic. David pioneered GE Fastworks with Eric Rice and coached emerging product teams at Adobe and Toyota before. And he has transitioned into consulting, and he spends a lot of time in advising and helping companies to uh, advance in their business idea realization. You can connect with David. You can see he's available at Twitter, LinkedIn, as well as email. And you can find more information on precoil.com. So with that, without further ado, I then hand it over to David to take us his schedule today. David, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I love working with product tanks. It's always fun. I did keynote. Let's see, it was Mind the Product. Well, before the pandemic, so it was in San Francisco. It was actually before my book was published, so I was kind of testing book content even at that event. But yeah, just love product tanks. I've spoken at I don't know how many at this point. I used to speak in person, right? I would speak at the ones in person in San Francisco and or in the Bay Area, but then distributed, I was been speaking remotely at a bunch of them. So just really appreciate the community, and it's always fun to hang out with product folks to get experimentation, and hopefully today I can give you some more just some more options, some ways to look at things, give you a few more ways to look at risk and how to de-risk things. So yeah, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is kind of behind the scenes based on the book. I wrote the book with Alex Ostwalder, basically because of my coaching, right? I've been coaching teams for a long time, and I felt as if I could probably synthesize some of that into a book, which is really hard to do. Even if you're an expert in something, it's just still really hard to do. But it's in 20 languages now. It's a bestseller. It's like 5 or 10% bestsellers in business books. So it's been received really well. So I'm super excited by it. So I'm just gonna give you some behind the scenes of how I coach teams and kind of go off of the concepts in the book. The goal today, so I'm not going to be using slides. I'm just going to use this mural board, but I will post a link in chat, and then you all can join me on the board. And if you're up for it, we could do a little quick, exercise before we wrap up with Q&A. But today my goal is just really to help you de-risk, like business and product ideas. Basically, one of the things I see time and time again is we scale these too quickly, and then we are frantically looking for a problem to solve with something we scaled, and it's not a fun position to be in. I've done that at a few startups. I've seen big companies do that too. And so just really trying to give you some options to help like incrementally de-risk what you're working on, so that when you do scale it, you feel more confident about the scaling, but also it's based off of evidence, not just like your intuition, which is nice for a product person. You should have intuition, but be really careful placing big bets on stuff that's just what people say. So we'll go into some of that today. And I do have a code of conduct with everything I do online, which is pretty much the Bill and Ted code of conduct, which is be excellent to one another. So if we do give feedback and we're sharing some of the things we've created in this workspace together, just be mindful of the tone and how you give feedback. Okay, so you all have seen this. I know Martin has really popularized this too. I really tried to trace like the single source of truth on this framing for the book, and I spoke to other people that have written other books in this space, and I was able to trace it back through IDEO, and then through Stanford D School, and then through Larry Keeley and Doblin Group, right, and then back to Institute of Design in Chicago. I have yet to find the single source of truth. It's just really rooted in human-centered design and design thinking, and it just works. So one of the reasons I love applying this to risk is that you sort of have to think about all three of these framing, and even in product, right? Because you're kind of stuck facilitating a lot of this. But basically, this idea of kind of like do they want this with desirability? You think about unmet needs, right? Jobs, pains and gains of your customer segment. Do they understand your value proposition? Does it resonate with them? All of that. Viability tends to be, I say, a should we. Granted, you should have a moral compass when you make business decisions and product decisions, but also is it financially, does it make sense? Will it sustain? Especially in big companies, sometimes you go too far away from the core, which you should go off and experiment beyond the core. But then if you don't have that relationship with sponsors, or you can't figure out the numbers, right? It just never gets funded. It never, even if you solve a real problem, it just doesn't get funded, and it can't survive. So viability, I say the should we, is it like even my work with Adobe, right? If we launch new products, and they're free, they still kind of tie into Creative Cloud, right? And so you're still trying to drive a KPI and some kind of revenue generator inside Adobe, even if you are launching free products, right? So we're still thinking through the viability of it. Is it viable, to our strategy? And then with feasibility, it's a can we question. And I think that is technical feasibility, but it's also beyond that. It's regulatory governance compliance. I work in a lot of heavily regulated industries. I don't really just play in software, right? I work in pharma, I work in chemical companies, healthcare. And in that, something could work from a technology point of view. But then if you are shut down by regulatory compliance, if you violate patient privacy laws here in the US, right, you would be shut down. I've not spent a lot of time in Germany. I did work with some companies in Munich before the pandemic, and loved it. Like I love the city. I loved working with the companies. I love the culture. I love the food especially. Had a great time in Munich, and but what really stuck out with me was just Germany's awareness of privacy laws. Right, you're kind of like leading the world in some ways of what privacy law should be. And here in the US, they're just not the same, right? So even techniques, I would say, oh, you could do this in Germany, you can't, right? And so you have to be careful of regions in the world with regards to feasibility, because you don't want to violate laws, local, regional, laws. So feasibility isn't just technical, and I think that's where I probably break a little bit from the standard interpretation of this drawing. Is I go beyond the technical and talk about governance, compliance, legal, regulatory, because also that could be a can we question, right? A risk. And so when you kind of look through this, my take on this is that you have to care about all three, even if you're in product, right? So for example, let's say you just focused here. Let's say you just focused on, okay, do people want this? And should we do this? Does it make money? Well, if you don't address the feasibility aspect of it, then potentially you get shut down or you can't execute. I see a lot of crowdfunding falls into this. I see a lot of crowdfunding campaigns where it looks great. You have the explainer video, people throw money at it. They want their perks. They want to be early adopters. But then you always get these like frequent updates, and then they're less frequent, and then they're like, oh, here's your t-shirt. They're like, I don't want a t-shirt, I want the actual product. And here's your stickers. I was like, I don't care about the stickers. And then eventually it's like, oh, sorry, we're shutting it down. It's like, no. And that's happened on quite a few crowdfunding campaigns, and it's mostly because they've not been able to figure out feasibility. And so one of the things I try to stress is, if you're testing via crowdfunding, just be mindful that you're testing desirability. Do people want this? You're testing a little bit of viability. You're testing, will they fund it? Will it generate some revenue? But you're not testing the backstage of cost, and also can you execute. And so I think some people just get really caught up in this idea of like one startup I joined, or I talked to, there was like some ex Google people out in the valley, and when I was talking to them, it's like, well, we didn't realize we had three startups in one. We had like firmware, software, and then we had hardware. Like, we had all this stuff that had to play together for this IoT thing that was crowdfunded, and they couldn't make it work. They couldn't source the stuff from China properly. They couldn't get the firmware to work. They couldn't get the app to talk to other things, and that's why they failed. And so it looked great in the explainer video, but unfortunately they didn't address viability. Let's say you address desirability and feasibility. So people want it and you can do it, but then you don't figure out the pricing, or you don't test pricing early enough. You can't keep your costs low enough to make a profit eventually. This happens quite a bit, and even in the Valley. I spent about 10 years in Silicon Valley, and there are a lot of things that get funded that just are never profitable, and they just keep raising rounds of money, to hope they finally get to a point. It's kind of weird how that works. It's almost like faking viability. I think a lot of products, think of products you love that are no longer around. Chances are they just weren't viable. At Mind the Product in San Francisco, I spoke about Clearly Canadian, which is a very like carbonated clear drink. It's back now, but it went bankrupt. Like it was really popular in the 90s, and then they just couldn't make the numbers work because it was very expensive to make and distribute and all that. And so I think there's some anxiety that comes with price testing, and so something to think about is just like, can you make it viable, and can you test viability sooner versus later? And then the one I find still far too often is this. You can do it and it looks like the numbers work, but then just nobody cares. We didn't spend enough time talking to the customer. We didn't spend enough time understanding their jobs, pains, and gains. Does their value prop resonate with them? And so if you neglect desirability, especially early on, then you're stuck with something that you've built that you're just looking for a market until you run out of money. Whether in a big company, it's you like they run out of patience. Usually, it's not usually money. It's usually like patience. And a startup, it's usually money. And I still see things get funded for over $100 million that have no customer insights whatsoever. It's like a slide deck in a dream, and I'm a unicorn, and people throw money at it, and they haven't even talked to customers, you know. And so I'm trying to change that. I'm literally working with $1 billion VC tomorrow. I have been for the last 7 years, trying to inject business modeling and testing and just like working through that stuff because that pattern is not sustainable. You know, throwing a bunch of money at people on a dream and then not testing it's just like it drives me nuts. So your role in product, whether you like it or not, you're kind of stuck facilitating a lot of this. Now you might not play a role in being an expert in all three of these phases. I would say product people usually viability. I see product people play there. Some of desirability. If you have technical skills, you might be playing the feasibility hat. But for the most part, you're trying to corral people that are experts in all three, and you're kind of in this world of how do I facilitate and how do I address all these types of risks that we have, because if we neglect one, we're probably going to fail in a big way, not a small way. So what Alex and I have been doing, and Alex was doing this before we wrote the book together, is kind of layering this thinking on top of some of the pre-existing tools, right? So you've probably seen a business model canvas. Alex created that. It's over 10 years ago at this point, I think. I think I first came across it in like 2010, probably, or 2011. And I felt like it worked pretty well as a one-page, here's our strategy, here's how things relate. And being able to kind of just layer some level of preference and priority on it, I think makes a lot of sense. So it's not perfect, but I think this idea of like desirability, a lot of your top right of this canvas ends up being desirability risk, your value prop and your customer segments. The bottom ends up being viability or cost and your revenue. And then the backstage ends up being feasibility. Can you deliver activities, resources, and partners? And so when I'm helping teams fill this out, right, chances are we're starting off with a bunch of desirability risk. It's a lot of, do people understand our value prop? Do they even know the words we're using? Do we, are we solving some kind of job they have, or relieving some kind of pain they have, or creating some kind of gain they're looking for? A lot of that ends up being desirability risk. And then when I'm jumping around and helping them kind of like sketch out the rest of their model, it kind of goes between, feasibility and viability. And so what happens here is we're trying to figure out, okay, can we deliver, acquire customers and deliver our value to them? Can we build some kind of relationship with them? Can we generate revenue from them either directly or indirectly? And then on the backstage, you're saying, okay, activities and resources. So think verbs, activities like key verbs you need to do. Resources, think nouns, think physical, digital, like IP or patents, or maybe you have a factory or a platform or a bot or something, or AI. What does all that cost? And then when you look at partners, you could say, oh, well, we partner with somebody because they bring an activity or a resource that either we can't have or don't can't create, or potentially even a channel, right, to help us reach our customers. You start looking at it, it's like, oh, it's more of like a system, right? The stuff relates. It's not just a series of check boxes. And I think that's a common mistake I see some teams make, where they just treat it as a checkbox, or it's taught that way to them, which is one level of using it, but it's not the level I tend to stay at. And you're starting to look at, okay, well, if we change our customer segment, what's that do to our channels? What's that do to our revenue streams? What's that do to who we partner with? And that is like getting it out of your head and just making it visual will help you so much. Being able to either like facilitate this or be able just to speak to this. And there are other variations of this canvas that are out there I know of. But basically being able to like understand the relationships between things and understand how things could change and how we have a kind of a series of assumptions here that we need to go test. So it doesn't become like innovation wallpaper. Right? That's always like bothered me when stuff is just, it looks pretty, but then we don't use it actionably. Like same thing with personas. I have clients in San Francisco that spent millions of dollars on personas. They don't even use them. I'm like, why did you spend millions of dollars on that? So what we do is, so first off, just help people sketch it out, like help your team kind of figure out, okay, what's our strategy? And then we start writing these kind of we believe statements. And I like colors. So I use orange for desirability, and I use blue for feasibility, and I use green for viability. And you can use whatever colors you want, but I like these colors. And so what we do is we have, the team together start writing down what would have to be true for this to work, right? And from there, it's like step one is getting them out of your head. That's really kind of the first part. And then what we do is we start bringing them over to map them. And so if you look at the early strategizer books, you'll see, some stack ranking and stuff like that. Value prop design book, which is very, very popular. I would say probably second to the business model generation book. You'll see a lot of stack ranking of things. And I think, I learned over the years that stack ranking is great for some things, but for risk, it feels a little artificial. And so I'd rather have a conversation with teams of, hey, like, what's the most important stuff that if we neglect will kill our entire opportunity, like our product or our business? And so, I created this 2x2. It's kind of variation. It's called assumptions mapping. It's kind of a variation of what Jeff and Josh do in Lean UX. I used to work with them back at Neo, and I knew them before when they were at Proof and stuff. Kind of like the early adopter Lean startup crowd, that I was hanging out with. And I love their 2x2 in the book. And then I realized, oh, but we don't have the themes involved. And then the labels didn't quite work for me with the teams. And so I just kept playing with it. And it looks very different now compared to what that is. There are other variations of this. Laura Klein has one. I think Esther has one. There's like all kinds of 2x2s. And I don't want to get in like 2x2 wars or anything here. But basically, the way I do it is I say, how important is this to the success of your business? And then do you have any evidence to support the statement? So that's why I like the we believes, because you're not doing questions, you're doing statements. Like these are statements that would have to be true for this to work. And then do we have any evidence to support that? And so the way it kind of works is we bring one over and we say, okay, how important is this? How much evidence do we have? And then when we map it, the rest of them kind of become relative in a way. So when I pull it over, I say, okay, team, is this more or less important? And do we have more or less evidence? And then usually big, oh, it's more important, but we have a little more evidence. And we kind of go through this conversation with each theme. And I usually start with, desirability. You don't have to, but I kind of just like work through this as a team. And so I coach people through this process. And it's based on what you know today. And a lot of people use this now, like Google uses this for their design sprint work. I did a talk with them before the pandemic. With their design sprint team, and a lot of governments use this. A bunch of people have just kind of taken it and run with it. But kind of what happens here is you end up with this like kind of structured conversation about risk. And so you could do this early in your product journey, right? So if you're using some version of Agile, right, before something makes it into a million user stories, you kind of run through this process and say, okay, do we understand what things we would need to run experiments for, right? If you're like doing road mapping, sometimes you're baking assumptions in your roadmap. And so you would use this. I use it. There's like many different on-ramps into it. I like using canvases, but you don't have to use a canvas. You can use other parts as well. But what happens is you kind of end up with this collection of things that as a team, right? And if you have representation of desirability, viability, feasibility that can speak to those on your team, then you start understanding, well, here's some things that if we ignore, we might be doomed. So, I used to work with Eric Ries who wrote Lean Startup, right? And he would call these like a leap of faith, with I'm pretty sure he got from like Kierkegaard or something. We might say a riskiest assumption. I see that a lot too, like your riskiest assumptions, right? But basically, whatever you want to call these, these are the things that if you ignore could potentially kill your entire opportunity, right? Your entire product. And so what we end up doing is this will probably be wrong in your first pass, but at least you're having the conversation and then you're going to go test and come back and update it, right? So what we do is we're just trying to systematically, it's almost like scientific method applied to product and business, although I would say it's more like a social science than anything else. You're just systematically going, okay, here's what we need to go tackle, right? And so one of the reasons I wrote the book was, well, first off, that 2x2. There's not a lot of people that know how to do it well. I see a lot of templates and everything, and people kind of they miss the nuances of like, oh, you need to talk when you do this. Here's how relatively like you do stuff, like how I showed the sticker like stickies move. Um, we usually do a whole thing on evidence, which I don't have time to cover today, but we go through light evidence versus strong evidence and what constitutes evidence, right? If you're curious, at the end of this, I'll give you a link. I'm doing a workshop on this next week as well. But one of the reasons I wrote the book was like 2x2. And the main reason I wrote the book was giving people options of how to run experiments from it. And so what we end up doing is we say, okay, now we know what's risky. What kind of experiments would we run to go address that risk? And so basically, I have 44 in the book. There's plenty more than 44, but I had to stop writing at some point. And the way I categorized them was like discovery and validation. So it's kind of building off a lot of Steve Blank's work with customer discovery, customer validation. But we wanted to go beyond customer. So we went overall discovery validation because we're going in desirability, viability, and feasibility. But basically, I mean, we can't cover all 44 experiments today. But the way to kind of think about them is like when you're starting off in discovery, you're really, from an evidence point of view, you're trying to go from almost like none to just light evidence. Is there any evidence of the jobs, pains, and gains of the customer? Any evidence our value prop resonates? Any evidence people are actively seeking a solution to this problem? So there's a lot of stuff that you could probably categorize under research here, but it's a lot of quick, scrappy, let's go find out any directional evidence that we're on the right track, there's something here at all, right? And I think this is kind of a mistake not a lot of product people make, but I would say we jump to build too quickly. And so people start building things, especially today, where cost of building has kind of come down a bit. If you build something no one uses, then you have to kind of reverse engineer like, why aren't they using it? And maybe we had the wrong customer and maybe we didn't spend enough time in discovery, right? A lot of what Teresa Torres espouses as well. And so this idea of, can we run some experiments to just get directional evidence that there's anything there that worth pursuing, right? For validation, it's a bit different from an evidence point of view. You're really trying to go from light evidence to strong evidence. And so here you already have some directional evidence that people understand the value prop and they're willing to pay for it, and it's more about the value exchange. And so there's always this term of like minimum viable product that gets thrown around, and it's very confusing because Eric popularized it, but also Steve Blank used it, but before that, like Frank Robinson used it, like 2001. You could trace minimum viable product back to like 2001. And if you look at the original definition, it was more about managing risk. And so it kind of gotten used, and Marty Kagan has his version, and there's all kinds of different versions of it. So instead of just arguing about it all, what I try to do is say, like, what kinds of MVPs or like, what's the process look like? And so I try to just call out the types that I see used, at least with my teams, the kind I coach, right? So one is I see things like concierge. So concierge is when you manually do it, you deliver the value manually, and people still can pay for it. So basically, you're not necessarily have a lot of tech involved. Like some of the travel companies I advise, before they do a bot for travel, they'll just book travel manually with customers, right, and see patterns, things like that. With Wizard of Oz, it's a little different. It's more like behind the curtain kind of interaction. So there's like either a digital curtain or a physical curtain where people behind the scenes are working on things. So again, with like something like AI, right? You see a lot of like people in spreadsheets and not a lot of AI early on, and then eventually get to AI. But as long as you're delivering value to the customer, they kind of don't care how much AI is involved. So a lot of like the startups I work with, the Valley, like the AI startups, It's a lot of spreadsheets early on, and a lot of people, not necessarily a lot of AI. And so when you think of Wizard of Oz, it's still delivering value, but you're kind of like taking steps to get to the point where you can, automate and scale. Single feature, I keep pointing to the Amazon Dash button. I feel like that's a great example of a single feature MVP where Amazon was testing Alexa strategy by doing away from screen purchasing. And so they would have this little physical button you press, and it would order, let's say, detergent for your washing machine. Now my washing machine is connected to the internet, and so it can just like automatically order stuff for me. But before then, like Amazon didn't know if people would purchase away from screen, so they had these little buttons. Right now they've been phased out, and people love them though. They still hack them today. You can still find versions where you press and stuff happens. Um, I think they kind of messed up. They launched this near April Fools, and people thought it was a joke, and it was actually part of their strategy. So it's like maybe not time it at April Fools, but I feel like that's a great idea as far as like an example of a single feature, to test, a strategy, and then mashups. I would say a lot of the low code, um, let's say low code, no code, right? Stuff. It's like you can wire together Airtable and a landing page and some kind of zap, and it like does stuff and delivers value. I would say in hardware, I see this with standard parts people kind of mash up together. I think Tesla is a great example, like early days. I met the founders of Tesla, which is not Elon Musk, by the way, no matter how much he tries to convince people he founded it. The actual founders I've met, and they mashed up like a Lotus Elise body with a bunch of like EV parts, and created that first prototype they tested with customers, which they called a mule, because that's like the automotive term for it. But it was kind of a mashup, and eventually they got to the Roadster, like the Tesla design stuff. But early on, it was just a mashup of different like vehicles and car parts and EVs, and just trying to see can we get like high performing EV that people would actually purchase, and worked out pretty well. Like 100 people pre-ordered $100,000 each US dollars. So that was a pretty successful pre-order campaign, I have to say. But basically, the way I tried to structure this is, here's a selection of things for you, and it's not just a list of stuff, but it's like, how do I choose, and can I illustrate how I coach teams in a way that you could get it like from a book, right? And so the taxonomy, I'll go into a little bit before we do a little exercise here. I can tell you a little about like the taxonomy we applied, and it's not perfect, but it was quite ambitious, I have to say. But I feel as if it kind of it works pretty well. And so what we do is we kind of, well, one, we had a professional illustrator draw each experiment, which I thought made it less intimidating. Like scientific method applied to products sounds very like, I can make people feel defensive, and so it's like, oh no, I'm going back to science class, and I hated class, like, so we tried to make it very friendly, very personal, right? And so we have these little illustrations. We have what categories they belong to, the names. We have the descriptions. So this one's concierge. So kind of a high level description. And then we kind of have this like taxonomy, which is the cost. So how much things cost. Now, granted, it does change per industry. Like if I'm working in pharma, if you're running a survey, it's going to cost different than if you're just doing some kind of B2C app for sharing photos of your cats, right? Like getting in front of radiologists is going to be a different price point than getting in front of like your average cat owner. So it does vary, but we try to do like basic, the average of things. What kind of evidence strength that it is throw off? So what kind of evidence strength does it generate? Here, we have updated this since the book. In the book, I say weak and strong. Now I've been using the frame light and strong, and Alex has kind of won me over with that, because we used weak evidence with like stakeholders inside companies. They would like react negatively to it, and they seem to be a little more acceptable. When we say light evidence, it's just directional evidence. They don't have like this visceral reaction to what have you been doing. It's just weak evidence, which is not the purpose of experimentation. We're not trying to set that framing. And so, the words matter. So we've been using light and strong instead of weak and strong. But basically, on a scale of 1 dot to 5 dots, how strong is the evidence it throws off? We have setup time and runtime. I used to have these as one, and then I realized some startup, like some of these experiments, take a long time to set up, but you run them for a short time, and then some take a short time to set up, and you run them for a long time. So we kind of broke it out into setup time and runtime. We have capabilities, which is kind of like, do I need a data scientist? Do I need legal? Who do I need in this? And then probably the one that sticks out the most is just those themes, right? We say desirable, viable, and feasible. Um, the experiments are categorized by those themes, and so you can kind of flip through and say, oh, I have a lot of desirability risk, what kind of experiments could I run? Or I have a lot of viability risk, how would I test pricing? Or I have a lot of feasibility risk, how would I test building this? And so we first I thought I could just slice a book up in those themes, and then I realized, which I should have realized earlier, but um, some experiments can be used for multiple themes, and so it didn't quite work that way. So that's why we ended up tagging experiments with the themes. And so, like for a concierge, you could say, oh, we're testing feasibility backstage here, right? um, we're testing desirability with this interaction, and then they're paying for it, and so we can test viability as well, right? We could also test viability back here. Let's get my drawing to work here, with the cost it takes, to create it. So basically, what we've tried to set out to do, and again, it's not perfect, but I think this idea of how do I look at risk? How do I map it? And then how do I choose an experiment that matches the kind of risk that I have? And then what kind of costs are incurred with this one? What kind of people will I need, or skills? How long is it going to take to set up and run? What kind of evidence strength does it generate? And so what I'm trying to convey to people is like, don't place a really big bet on just like interviews and surveys, because it's pretty light evidence. Try to do something after that, like, oh, and I'll sketch one out for you here in a minute, but try to build up a case for, what's it mean to invest in this over time. So I know we're giving away some books, but what I also did here is I included a cheat sheet that Tendai Vicky, who's associate partner strategizer, helped create and shared with me from the book. So it's kind of like, it doesn't go as deep as the book, but there's like little cards here in the board. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post this link in chat. Full disclosure, I do advise Mural. So, but you don't have to pay for this account. You can just enter as visitor, and you'll be like anonymous snail or lobster or something at the bottom of the screen. If you want to create an account, there are free accounts as well. But for today, you can just join us. Yeah, I see anonymous crab and penguin down there. So this is available to you. I'm going to leave this board up for 30 days. And what I have here for you is all the experiments. So for example, you're like, hey, what's a feature stub? You can double click on that thing and the PDF's there. And so you can zoom in and say, oh, a feature stub. Okay. So this is what Google does all the time, right? There's like a stub of a feature, and it says, when you click on it, it's like, oh, we're not ready yet. There's some kind of like survey or some call to action. It's usually because they're arguing internally on whether or not it should be a good idea to build, and they just launch a stub to see how it's received by customers and inject like evidence into the conversation. There's some other companies used to do that a lot, like TripAdvisor used to do this all the time, and other companies. But what I have here is a collection. So there's the discovery here, and then if you scroll down, there's the validation as well below it. So what I thought while you check those out is that I can share kind of like a real life story of a couple experiments, and then you can play with this, and then we can do some Q&A. So I've used this before at a ProductTank, but it's such a great example. Is the example I'm going to use is a men's dating advice chatbot. All right. So this is a real example, by the way. It's a team out of New York. And they said, look, we need to build a men's dating advice chatbot. So it's a bot that would give men dating advice on like where to take their first date. So instead of building it, the first thing they did was they did customer interviews. So they kind of interviewed men about their jobs, pains, and gains, where they get their dating advice, what was conflicting about it. They did about 10 or 15, if I remember correctly. And then they did search trend analysis. So basically, they went in and searched using like Answer the Public and Keyword Planner, and Google Trends. Like, is anybody else searching for what we heard in the interviews at scale in different regions, different cities? From there, they did some paper prototyping. So basically, they kind of just like sketched out what the bot could do. From there, they did a landing page, and they also drove traffic to that page from discussion forums. So this one, they use discussion forums as like almost like acquisition. They use Hacker News and places like that. And then they did what I would call Wizard of Oz. So, so the funny story about this one. So what kind of happened here was, well, first off, I love that they didn't start with just building. I love that they thought, well, we could just build a chat bot, but that could potentially go awry, especially if you don't know the kind of questions people would ask and all that. And so they had this small team. They had this small team of women, and basically, I think there were like 3 total, and I still talk to some of them. Actually, one of them is starting. She found a new company and raised funding for it, which is kind of like this, but for parents, for developmental milestones for their kids and what they should buy. It's really different framing, but same kind of concept. So what happened was when they launched the page, so they kind of launched the page and did the discussion forums, they had 1,000 signups in a few hours. So what happened was that was way too much info and requests for these women who were like, what am I supposed to do with thousands of requests for dating advice? And so it overwhelmed the women, and then the people in Hacker News were like, I'm so, hopeless that the bot's ignoring me in my dating life. And so what instead they had to do really quickly was they had to do a wait list. And I think in hindsight, the wait list would have probably been a better option, because sometimes you underestimate how popular something's going to be. And so having it go too big is also problematic. But what I loved is that they used what they learned from interviews to do search trend analysis, that they learned from that to inform the paper prototyping, from that to do, the landing page. And then, finally got to a Wizard of Oz where they could kind of like fake the experience, because they basically just texted men dating advice pretending they were a bot, essentially, because they all use the same tone and sentence structure and everything, to see if anybody cared. Now, coming back to our themes, though, where this one kind of struggled, if we think of our 3 circles that we all know so well, so desirability, viability, feasibility. Desirability was like, yep, people loved it. Like that was like, it was actually overwhelming. It topped the Product Hunt one day. It had all this free press. Like tech journalists were writing about it. It was crazy. Feasibility was kind of a question mark, though, because you have to take all the requests from the bot. So you have to take all the requests that are coming in. We were like using Twilio for this, and then form them, like basically synthesize and look for patterns, and then kind of build a bot based on real evidence. But that's still hard to do. We could do it. Probably need a data scientist. Probably need like some other team members that weren't necessarily equipped, to do it. Like bring in more team members and such. It was kind of like, yeah, we probably could, but it wasn't trivial. And then viability was a big no. Like people did not want to pay for a dating advice chatbot. That might have changed. Maybe now people would. This was a few years ago, but we just couldn't figure out, a business model for it. I'd like to think people would get better at dating over time. Maybe not. You wouldn't need like a subscription to a bot to tell you dating advice. But essentially, this is something that like people wouldn't pay for. So eventually it was sunset. It was shut down, and there was a case study written upon it and everything. But I think it was a great idea of a sequence, right? They went from interviews to trend analysis to paper prototyping to landing page, discussion forums to Wizard of Oz. So what I thought might be fun is I'll put the link back here in chat for those of you that are hanging out with us. I thought it would be cool, and you can get some advice from me in real time here. If there's something you're working on that you could just use some stickies here and sketch out what you think some experiments could be that could help you. I'm not looking for acceptance criteria and metrics to measure and all that. I'm just looking at sticky note level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a timer here for like 5 minutes. And if you're here, what I'd like for you to do is you can kind of scroll over to the experiments and check them out, right? So you have the discovery experiments here, you have the validation experiments here. but you can just put your sequence under mine. Basically, all you do is double click and it creates a sticky, and you can just type in it. It's pretty straightforward. If you can't type, there's a good chance you're in move mode and it won't let you. It'll say you're in move mode. You just have to click off your hand. For those of you on a computer, for trackpad, you can use your fingers to zoom in and everything. But I'm going to play some music and set a timer. And what I'd love to see, what I'd love to see from you and hear from you is, hey, what are you working on that has like a lot of uncertainty, maybe a new product that you're working on, and what kind of experiments you think you could kind of string together that might help de-risk it. All right. So 5 minutes, I'll play some music and go. Have about 3 more minutes left. Have about a minute left. All right, try and finish up. Oh, and for those of you in the board, I put a link to my upcoming event here over on the right. So if you double click on the upcoming events, you'll see the workshop I'm running next week. So there's still a few tickets left for that one. So it's something if you have a friend in product or somebody that's working on something new and they want to run through this process for 3 hours, then I'm doing something public. I don't do a lot of public stuff, but that's one of the ones I'm doing. All right, time is up. So, I felt you all would be like Product Tank people just get this stuff. So you're very proficient compared to like some other groups I do, and they're just like one or two stickers. You have like this elaborate kind of process. So it's really cool to see the differences between the two. So I see some here. I see going from interviews to link tracking to a single feature. Yeah, that's a pretty good one. Although there's probably even more stuff you could do before a single feature on there. Day in the life to storyboard. That's a pretty interesting flow. You observe and then you kind of synthesize it into a flow. Paper prototyping to a mashup. Yep. We have interviews to paper prototyping to a landing page to a brochure to an MVP for innovation skills in healthcare. Yeah, I've been working a lot in healthcare recently. It's pretty crazy how many different like profiles you have, right? You have like the user customer and the recommender and the influencer and the decision maker, but the economic buyer is different. It's like, yeah, pretty complicated world. Trend, so interview surveys to search trend analysis. That's a good flow too, because you can use what you've learned from there into informing your search trend analysis to a day in the life, to a buy a feature, to a speedboat. Yeah, buy a feature and speedboat I use for preference and prioritization. So like you're trying to figure out what are the jobs, pains, and gains they have, or what kind of features would they prefer versus them just telling you everything's the most popular, like the most important. For B2B, I use a lot of those. For a cycling app here, we have discussion forums to card sorting to discovery survey to paper prototyping, landing page, online ads, and waitlists. Yeah, that's a pretty common flow to get people into something where even after the waitlist, you could still go interview them, right? And try to figure out why they signed up, because you know they signed up, but maybe you don't know why. And so I use that flow sometimes to source interview candidates with the page. Then you can go and interview them. We have another one here, web traffic analysis to survey to interview to paper prototype to single feature to life size to letter of intent. Yeah, with letter of intent, I usually do that before a big like contract or something, or a big prepayment thing. It's like a one-page non-legally binding document. So a lot of my B2B clients also use that, where we'll say, oh, it sounds like you're very interested. Can you sign this LOI? And so the case they have in the book was like a connected sprinkler company, and they would go to landscapers and have them sign LOIs for how many units they wanted to purchase. And that helped them get a real, well, I would say a better idea of the real demand versus like, oh yeah, I'll buy 50. And then they do an LOI and they write 25. And it's like, well, that's not the number you told me. And then we have this one that's pretty involved, this Longify. So interviews to Figma. Yeah, Figma is really popular with prototyping now, especially early stage. You can do so much so quickly. Interviews, then have a page with an ebook, and then capture people. So you have some acceptance criteria here too, and then give them a premium account, and then engage with them, and then they interact, and then get rid of stuff that they don't interact with, and then implement. Yeah, this one's pretty involved. Yeah, so I would say what happens when you sketch something out like this is just be open to the idea of like there might be parts where you have to go back, right? So like if your landing page, no one signs up for your ebook, then you would go back and tweak probably your wording. You'd probably make sure you understand the jobs, pains, and gains. So, but very, very cool. Like you all came up with some pretty amazing stuff here. So yeah, just trying to give you more tools, like or more options, you know, so it doesn't just go interview surveys, build the whole thing, right? There's so many things you could do in between. And then when you're paying for, like when you're making an investment decision, it's based on more evidence and not just, you know, something that is very light evidence. So very cool. We have some time and I can hang out a few minutes over. What kind of questions y'all have for me? I don't know if there are any questions that came through the chat, or if you all want to unmute and yell questions at me, that works too. But I know we covered a lot, but what kind of questions you have for me about, you know, how this impacts product, or what you're working on? Happy to entertain a few before we wrap up.
Thanks, David. There was one question coming through the chat. Lisa, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself. I can just also read it.
Yeah, sure. Hi. Greetings from Munich. And David, I'm very relieved that you found the Munich food very good. Some people don't like it, so it's nice to hear.
Especially breakfast.
So
I like breakfast.
Okay. Excellent. So yeah, my question is around the hypothesis prioritization grid that you showed earlier. So we've been trying to do that in the past, and as you may know, especially around if you do some gut feeling prioritization, it's always hard to find a ranking which suits everyone, and everyone kind of thinks everything's important. So in your experience, what would be a good approach to bring in some clarity and some relative ranking?
Yeah, you learn a lot about your team when you do this and how they think. You know, the teams I work with in Germany were very precise in how they organize things, and the cultural differences also between US and Germany. I was trying to navigate there. And I was just trying to think how it went down when I worked with those teams in Munich. You know, what tended to work is that when everyone they wanted to put everything at the top, you know, the questions I would ask would be, well, how are these related to one another? Is like they're one, if we take it off, does it impact others? You know? And so I don't do it a lot, but sometimes when I'm facilitating the 2x2, I try to get people to think through the relationship between the stickies. And I don't want to overcomplicate it or anything, but this idea of, oh, well, if this one's wrong, it doesn't matter what these others, like, it doesn't matter if we have the best looking app in the world. Like, if they don't have a need, then it doesn't matter what we build. And so I try to just probe a lot. And because I'm external, I can ask, you know, I don't want to say like dumb questions, but I'm not an expert in the industries I really play in, right? Because I play with like, you know, I'll jump from like Toyota, which is working on autonomy, and I'll jump to Adobe, which is like digital apps, and then I'll go to pharma, which is like, you know, cancer treatment, right? So, you know, basically what I try to do is ask, what if proven wrong would cause this whole thing to fail? And not everything is the first one, you know, when it comes to that usually. And so it's kind of a trick for facilitation, but I think just asking, you know, how these impact each other. Is there one that keeps you up at night? Is there one that we can test sooner versus later where we have access to customers? And so I just try to keep asking questions if they're really struggling with it. But it kind of depends on your team. Like some teams I have put everything above the line, you know, that have evidence line, like nothing goes below it. And then other teams have stickies down there and they're like, you know, these aren't really, we wrote these down, but compared to these other ones, they're not that important. And so you just, some of it's like team dynamics you have to navigate as well. And so I think having representation from all three themes in the session helps, but you know, try not to let one person dominate the conversation as well. Yeah, so I would be asking like, which ones impact the rest, you know, and then which ones, if proven wrong, would cause the rest to fail. Those kind of questions usually help them prioritize a bit better.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I've facilitated hundreds, thousands of these so far, and each one I learn a little bit different, you know, how a team thinks, how they think about risk. And basically I'm just trying to get them to focus their experimentation, because I don't want them experimenting on stuff that is unimportant and they already have a bunch of evidence on, because they'll do things like, oh, let's launch a landing page. But I'm like, but we already know the demand, and like, why are we doing a page? And it's like, oh, because it's fun. And it's like, well, like it's fun, but how does it address our risk? And so this kind of helped me focus teams, because I would get in trouble with teams where I would get them very excited about experiments, and they would just be running things that they thought were kind of fun to do, and it didn't necessarily pay down the risk in what we're working on. And so now I'm a little more diligent about it, where I'm trying to tie it back to, okay, what's the risk we have? And then let's tie our experiments back to that in a real way, versus just kind of experimenting to see what happens, because you're always successful in seeing what happens. So any other questions for me?
There's one in the chat from Eva. I can just read it. Can you tell what to take into account in testing ideas in healthcare? You mentioned the many levels of customers as one thing.
Yeah, I've been working a lot in healthcare over the last few years. I think some of it's like pandemic response because I've been working with people on the pandemic response, but also just things like cancer treatment and the U.S. system of healthcare is pretty broken, so there's plenty of room for innovation, and so it's more complicated than it needs to be, and so a lot of things that I'm working on, like anyone I can talk about. And then telehealth and teledentistry have really picked up. So for example, like people not wanting to go into the doctor to get their annual checkups. And it's like, well, could you test a way to have them do their checkups at home? Like if you ship them the equipment and walk them through it through FaceTime or through something, could you get them to do it and generate and package up the stuff and send it back to you? Same thing with teledentistry, right? People didn't want to go into the dentist when this during the pandemic. And so they're like, okay, can we do a tele appointment and you tell me what's wrong? And we learned a lot, even keeping it low, because sometimes these companies are like, oh, we should build a platform and an app and onboard all these dentists and roll it all out. And then we find out things like, well, let's just test it through FaceTime or Google Hangouts and get a dentist and a patient connected and see what happens. And what would happen is they're trying to hold up their phone and they can't open their mouth and hold the phone, or they can't get a light in their mouth so the dentist could see what was going on. Like we learned so much, and an app wasn't going to, eventually an app could help solve that, but it would have been really tragic to build like this very polished app and then realize that people can't hold the phone and open their mouth at the same time and get a good view. The dentist could even comment on it. And so all this stuff, like you can be really, really scrappy in your early stage product development and use existing tools, right? I would say the stuff that comes in over and over again, patient privacy laws, like you can't just ask for, personally identifiable information through Typeform. Like you actually have to go to Typeform, and there's a way you can get it certified in a way where it could support that. But a lot of these scrappy, B2C tools and methods with healthcare, you just have to say, okay, what's approved that we could use to do that, and so you can't just have a basic form and just have people typing in all their health problems in, right, with their social security numbers and stuff. It just doesn't work. And so that's been the biggest learning for me is like, okay, we know what we need to focus on, but what are like approved ways we could go find that information out? Because some of the stuff in B2C doesn't work in that B2B world. So I'm constantly learning, but we're pretty much like breaking it down, looking at all the different players. Do we have a strong value prop to each? Can we test it? Do they understand it? And then can we do something very fast using existing tech that's approved that we can get some feedback on? Is there anything there before we go really big and do something completely architected at scale? So it's a couple things I've been working on. It's a really, like, there are a lot of wicked problems in healthcare. It's not like simple. It's a lot of different impacts, underserved communities, all kinds of stuff that's going on. But try to visualize it, break it down, test it, and test it in ways that aren't going to get us, in trouble, basically.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. Taylor, you have your hand up and a question in the chat. You want to speak up?
Yes.
Hi.
David, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. The first question I was having is if you create a business model, then you will create, for example, a bunch of hypotheses to make because if all the hypotheses will be true, then you don't have any risk and you can go from explore to exploit. But how can you determine the risk you will reduce by making a hypothesis true? Because it's not exact science, but how do you have tricks on how to determine, oh, if this hypothesis is true, then this is the amount of de-risking I've done? Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, Alex and I have played around with that in Tendai as well, Tendai Viki, and I've really paused a lot of my efforts on it because what happened was, in my opinion, you could do like a investment readiness kind of thermometer thing, and you can pay down and you can say, well, based on this calculation, we've paid down this risk. And my last in-person workshop in Europe was in Shoreditch right before the pandemic. It was a book launch. Alex did a couple days and I did a couple days after it. And I was surprised people would stay 4 days for a public workshop doing two. I thought people would totally go home and not show up for mine, but they did. I presented some of that there, and I've kind of paused it for now. Alex might have a different take, but I felt like you have to be careful because you can give like a decimal point sort of reduction of risk illustration, but then behind it, it almost gives you a false sense of accuracy because it's so complex. And so I've kind of paused a lot of my efforts around it. It's not to say that it can't be done. But typically, you know, if you're using test cards, we're using the acceptance criteria in a test card to say, did your big test pass or fail? And then we try to say, okay, did this support your hypothesis? Did it refute it, or was it unclear? And here are the things you would do in each step, right? So if it's, you know, do you persevere? Do you pivot? Do you kill? Do you retest? All that. But I haven't got down to like the quantification yet. It's probably doable, even with a 2x2. You could probably quantify that. But I feel as if I'm still working on just getting people to work this way. And so I feel that's probably the next step. And I'm just not well equipped to apply that level of quantification to it. So it's possible. I feel as if I personally stopped because I felt like I was giving people this precise number that when you dug in under the hood, it didn't seem like the math always worked out. And so, yeah, I would say that's probably where it's headed. But right now, I've kind of paused those efforts until I figure something, a better approach out.
Yeah, and are you planning to come to Europe in the future for doing an in-person training?
Maybe. So Alex and I are talking about, so I usually do 2 public masterclasses a year, like big 3-day events. Right now they've been online, but Alex just ran one as a hybrid, and he and I were talking yesterday about that. And so if I was to go to Europe, maybe I do something hybrid related. Right now it's all virtual. Well, I'm doing in-person US. I haven't done in-person Europe. So it's probability. It's just timing and where to do it. So, but I don't have anything scheduled at the moment. Everything I'm doing right now that would be available to Europe is virtual for the near future anyway.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Gabriel?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Dave, for all the insights. I'm the Longify guy who came up with this long workflow there in your board. Sorry for messing this up. Basically, I'm in that stage of building this Longify app. I'm a software developer, and I'm on the way to have the first prototype available. And my question to you is the following. So I plan to create a landing page and with a kind of, you know, MailChimp behind where I can get some user emails and get in touch with them. So my first idea is to have 100 users, you know, in this mailing list, and then maybe contact 10 to 20 max for a 1-hour interview online for those who are willing to contribute with the app. My question to you is that I can keep running this process to get a lot of ideas, to plan my backlog, to prioritize the features and implement the features. But how do you decide the moment to stop that and to bring the prototype to real life? I mean, to make it a product? Yeah. How do you make sure that the number of users you have interviewed that really represents the possible customers you're gonna have there? So this is the,
Yeah, I get that question a lot. Even when even before I was working at Neo, and we were like this little lean startup agency that was acquired by Pivotal. We would get that question even back then, which was, at what point do I stop like doing this work and then make it a real, quote unquote, like real app? I feel that line's blurry. It's not necessarily. I view it as almost like discovery and delivery. Like in the beginning, you're doing a lot of discovery and probably a little bit of delivery. And then as you migrate through and learn more and you have more evidence, you might do less discovery and more delivery, right? And so, but it should never, in my opinion anyway, I'm really careful to all or nothing, right? Because even if you have that product going, you're going to have to do discovery to figure out what features to add and what to remove and all that. So I try to look at it as like a spectrum. And so, but what I have done in the past is like, if you have some kind of prototype that it's working enough and people pay for it and it's value, but you realize it can't scale. I've had people in teams where we throw all that away and rebuild it the right way, like a way that's scalable and secure and everything that we need. And so that's a hard decision usually because they're like, oh, I can't throw stuff away. but in reality, you can't scale that like that MVP you have, right? And they're not meant for scaling; they're meant for learning. And so I would say once you get people in there and you have, I don't know what your numbers specifically are, you know, as far as revenue, recurring revenue, and who's paying and who's not, and who's churning out. There's a bunch of science behind that, but I would say at some point you'll probably have to make a decision whether or not that code base will let you scale or you rebuild it. I would say a lot of the low code, no code stuff now will give you 1 to 2 years, which is surprising to me. So you can do something in that, and it gives you more time. But eventually, you know, you might have to come back and rebuild the thing. But what I would just be aware of is like, don't try to start with that mentality of like, I'm just going to build the perfect thing that's going to scale, because that's where we get in trouble, where we spend a lot of time building and what we've built doesn't really solve for the jobs, pains, and gains of the customer. And then we're stuck with something that, yeah, it could scale, but it's never going to because the demand's not there. So, so yeah, I mean, I think with your background in software, I almost like approach it like, there's this kind of thing I learned from Kent Beck way back in the day, which is like test-driven development, which is like you create your tests and then you write your code and then you refactor. It's almost like that, but applied to product, right? It's almost like test-driven product where you're going through that loop and you're kind of going through it, and it's very iterative. So at some point, you know, you're going to get to a point where you can feel better about scaling and making that investment decision. But it's not like a perfect number I would give you, an amount of weeks or number of users. It's going to be a little fuzzier than that, in my opinion. So
Yeah.
sorry if that's not a clear answer.
No, thank you for the hint. Anyway, I'm just starting the process, so I have a prototyping. I'm now pitching to some business angels, and most of them, they ask, how do you validate that people are really willing to buy your solution, right? And this is very much connected to how many people would be willing to buy eventually the product. So thanks a lot for the hint, and I think, yeah, it helps to understand how this whole process works. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it depends on where you're getting funding from and everything. Like I used to hang out, well, when Clubhouse was really popular in the pandemic, like the people from Techstars would just do, like Saba and team would just do like live coaching interviews of people pitching to them. And a lot of the times they'd be saying, how many paying customers do you have? And for a B2B, you know, 10 paying customers might be enough.
Yeah.
But for B2C, it might be a bigger number, right? But they would always ask, do you understand your customer really well, and prove it that you understand them really well? And do you have anybody paying now? And I think that's the big thing. And that's the same with Y Combinator. Like if you try to get into YC and they ask you about your customers and you don't have good answers, there's no chance you're getting in. So
Exactly.
It's very much having deep understanding of your customers. Do you have any paying customers? And then can you keep that going long enough where if you needed to rebuild and scale it, you can. But it kind of varies per industry and per like B2C versus B2B. But don't underestimate, like even having 10 paying customers is sometimes enough evidence for people willing to invest. So
I start calling the family now. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, funding this stuff is a whole other thing that I'm passionate about. I'm just not quite there. I'm working with VCs in the Valley. I'm just trying to get them to stop funding things because they put blockchain in the slide deck. So it's like, please don't fund that just because they have a word. All right. So yeah, I think I'm at time here on my side. But again, I'll leave this board up for you for usually I I leave them up for 30 days, right? And then I'll archive it, but it's here for you to access for 30 days. And I hope I gave you some more options as far as looking at risk and how to think about it. And then with the experiments, it's really about matching the experiments to your risk, and then kind of just understanding you have to do more than one. You know, try not to treat your experiments as like one-off, unrelated things. Try to think about them as, I'm trying to build up a case of evidence for whether or not I should invest in this product or not. And that means team, that means money, right, and resources. So hopefully it just gave you some more options today. And yeah, cheering you all on. Like I love the community. So I think you all are in a great space. You already know this stuff to a degree. It's just, you know, just getting even better at it. So thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, David. It was a pleasure to have you here tonight, and thank you for the interesting new tools that we can all apply to our products. Before you all leave, I just wanted to say also thank you to everybody for joining tonight, for the nice questions and discussions. We're wrapping up 2022, but we're looking forward to 2023, and we are looking for local speakers for in-person events. So if you live close to Heidelberg and would love to talk at one of our events, or know somebody who would be great at it, just reach out to us via LinkedIn. And so we'd love to hear from you, basically. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining, and have a lovely evening, and have a lovely day, David. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck
Thank
testing
you.
assumptions.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Bye.